Folks, myself personally, I like a good game that has the power to make me upset. I like the Fear and Hunger games, and Silent Hill, and Lisa the Painful, not because they make me feel all warm and fuzzy inside, but because their subject matters are so mature and bold and graphic, and it makes them damn compelling. I am powerfully drawn to concepts, designs, and depictions that are intended to disturb, as are many of you watching, you sickos. Which brings us to Fromsoft and their lovely games from the past 15 or so years. Cause folks, even though Bloodborne is the only one that can outright be called a horror title with its intense themes of blood, beasts and cosmic terror, they all get really messed up at times, way more than most actual horror games dare to do, and I for one love that shit. And so I thought, hey, for the Halloween season, why not make a fun video featuring what I consider to be Fromsoft's 20 most disturbing monsters, taking into consideration their designs, attacks, backstories, grim implications, etc. And I'm including both bosses and regular enemies here, cause why the hell not? This isn't necessarily a list of scariest enemies, or goriest, or spookiest. It's the most disturbing ones, the ones that just stick with you for one reason or another, the really fucked up stuff. And hey, be sure to let me know your own picks down in the comments. So without further ado, let's kick off the countdown with my first entry in this loathsome list. First off, we have the rotted corpse from Bloodborne, found in the central Yharnam sewers, and also beyond the village in the Forbidden Woods, and probably the Chalice dungeons, I assume. Not the most exotic of enemies, I know, but these wretched crawling horrors have always bothered me more than most enemies in this generally pretty horrific game. I mean, in central Yharnam you have your packs of villagers armed with various crude weapons intended for butchering any bothersome outsiders foolish enough to cross their path, but these guys, although in various stages of beasthood, are still quite comprehensible. They're batshit insane, are turning into beasts and are out for blood, literally. Then down in the sewers, you have the likes of the oversized pustule-covered rats, crows, and even a big, massive, fat fucking pig. But then you've got these guys, and what's the deal with them? I get the wolfmen, and the monstrous animals, and even the creepy pale church guardians further ahead in Cathedral Ward, but there's something about these mindless piles of blackened rot languishing down here in the sewers that gets to me. Alive when they should be completely lifeless, their lower bodies necrotized away to the point where all they can do to attack you is either lunge forward with their elongated claw-like hands, or vomit up thick caustic bile, the exact same substance that spurts from their bodies when attacked instead of regular blood. The designs are horrific, but I think it's the sewer aspect that disturbs me most. If you'll allow me to go on a tangent for a second, like many people my age, I saw the original It TV movie when I was way too young, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I was not ready for it. There were many overtly scary things about that movie, but one of the scariest at some deeper dark level was when Georgie first meets Pennywise, who, in an attempt to lure Georgie down the drain, says,
"Oh, you want it, don't you, Georgie? Oh, of course you do. And there's cotton candy and rides and all sorts of surprises down here."
The book, which I'd later read and love, goes even deeper. Quote, "He reached forward again and drew his hand back again. How did you get down there?" "Storm just blew me away," Pennywise the dancing clown said. "It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie?" Just the idea that the circus was washed away down to the drains below the city, and now there's just this entire troupe and tent down there, carrying on their act amidst the filth and the pitch blackness. It's a really scary idea to me. Now, as far as I can tell, these rotted corpse enemies aren't part of any circus troupe, but even so, they are alive and shifting and rotting down here in this fetid sewer amongst the rats, and it's fucking grim. Like I said, you also find them in the Forbidden Woods, though instead of them being found below ground there, they're half submerged in a pool of thick, flammable oil, which is also really messed up. They're up here at the surface instead of down in the sewers, yet they're still consigned to languishing in the oil pools, perhaps discarded here by the beast villagers who at least still have the ability to walk around and even communicate to one another through maddened shouts. I don't think rotted corpses are an enemy most people think of with Bloodborne. Most folks think of the beasts and the great ones and stuff first, and so do I, but I also always think of Yharnam's sewers and the foul collection of living carrion which dwell there in the darkness. And now for something completely different, presenting the Locust Preachers from Dark Souls 3. Of the 3 Dark Souls games, the third in the trilogy is by far the darkest and most depressing. In fact, I actually have more monsters from Dark Souls 3 in this list than I do from Bloodborne. Whereas I kicked the video off with something traditionally disturbing, with a borderline zombie, the Locust Preachers by comparison are of a far different character and appearance. They are introduced in the Ringed City DLC and are indeed encountered in the titular Ringed City, mostly in and around the swamp area. The very first one, however, is seen just down the stairs past the first Judicator Giant, though rather than the overgrown agent of pestilence attacking you on sight, just like nearly every other entity in the game, it instead delivers an ominous and enigmatic sermon.
One was a wayfaring knight on an endless, forbidden search. Only the abyss granted closure, if not reunion with his beloved. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin.
Profoundly creepy encounter, and indeed there are a further 2 so-called white-faced Locust Preachers beyond, who'll spout cryptic fragments of lore at you upon meeting them, with the subjects of these sermons being various NPCs encountered throughout Dark Souls 3, though delivered with an uncanny vagueness so that it's difficult to pin down exactly what it is they're saying and what they mean. In addition to the 3 non-hostile locusts, many small ones are found skittering around the swamp in search of their next feast, because indeed, at the end of every of the Locust Preacher's sermons, they always close out with the line,
"Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin."
Aside from the proselytizing locusts, there are also the immediately hostile kind to worry about, the ones so consumed with greed and hunger that they've forgotten their original purpose, that being to beckon men to the dark with their sermons. Coolest aspect of combat with the locusts is the chilling line they utter as they initiate their grab attack.
I shall not.
One of the very few regular enemies in this game that actually speaks to you as you fight them. Only other example I can think of are the Evangelists. A fun fact about this attack is that it used to be an important part of DS3 all bosses speedruns, which I used to watch all the time back in the day when the game and the DLCs came out. Here's Distortion 2 getting deliberately caught out by the grab to skip further through the DLC. Enough fun though, this video isn't supposed to be fun. It's about freaky shit that makes you uncomfortable, and the Locusts have always succeeded in having that effect on my ass. The Ringed City DLC in its entirety is a grim and desolate experience. In a good way, mind you, it's great. But the whole affair has a tendency to leave me feeling kinda sad by the end, that this is how the Dark Souls saga ends, in dust and darkness. The thing about the Locusts that bothers me though is that they know things. They are these monstrous but intelligent entities creeping out from behind dark corners and whispering strange sermons to you as you pass through this dead city sinking into a swamp. These pestilential preachers of the dark, here to usher in and enjoy some unspeakable next phase in this dying world cycle before it eventually turns all to nothing. There are certainly a few more gross insect type Fromsoft designs that I could have picked for my list, but none with as much ominous narrative weight as the Locust Preachers. Hey, how about some Elden Ring? You better believe there's going to be plenty of Elden Ring in this video, bucko. Numbers 20 and 19 were made of flesh and bone, or flesh and chitin, in the case of the Locusts, but for number 18 I have a mechanical construct. I have the Flame Chariots. You'd think a monster that's actually a machine shouldn't have the power to disturb the soul, and in fact, through all the Souls games, Bloodborne and Sekiro, none really have. I mean, the Iron Golem and Smelter demons are pretty rad, but they don't freak me out. But then Elden Ring hit the scene and gave us metallic serpentine abominations like the Abductor Virgins, who, although not officially a part of this list but more an honourable mention, are unnerving to say the least, especially that mental one without a head on Mount Gelmir. Jesus. Never mind those snake-filled kidnapping constructs though, cause the flame chariots freak me out even more. First place I saw one would have been in Liurnia, the one stationed with all the rare Lucaria soldiers, and I did not like what I was seeing. This disconcertingly large green head rolling around on a pair of wooden wheels and literally spitting out fireballs and flame swathes from its spiked machine mouth. You also find flame chariots fighting alongside the Flame Guardian contingent at Mount Gelmir's Fort Lyde, and in a couple of places in Caelid, most notably Caelum Ruins, where the harder varieties of the chariots are found, sporting additional flamethrowers at either side of their head for ever more heated encounters. And folks, it's the whole head thing that freaks me out. The idea of a massive flame-throwing head on wheels is frightening enough, but when you make it look like this too, bloody hell. The first line from the Visage Shield's item description reads, "Tricksome bronze shield depicting the face of a fire giant." Me myself personally, I don't really think this does look all that much like a fire giant, at least not the one we fight. I think this one's way scarier actually. The blotchy green pseudo skin and hairless head sets it apart for one, but the eyes are horrid. It gives these chariots an expression of infernal suffering, as if they can actually feel intense distress from the red hot spikes and pipes of metal jammed into their mouths, and worst of all, the eyes follow you around as you move, making the head seem disconcertingly lifelike, and it's fucking terrifying. I remember years ago seeing this video of some dude in a hospital where the lower half of his face had just been blown apart from a gun or explosive, but the top half of his head was intact and he was still fully conscious. Horrible video, obviously, but the reason I bring it up here is because the expression on the flame chariots, particularly the eyes, reminds me of the look on that guy's face. Kind of feel like I ruined the mood a bit by bringing that up, so let's move on. Blessedly, the monstrous visual effect is somewhat dispelled when you reach their rear. There's always a wee man jammed in the back with his ass sticking out for you to launch a crispy critical on. Or if you have a significant elevation advantage on one, you can launch a special plunge attack into the heat vent and watch the chariot explode for a guaranteed one-hit KO. Machine or not, super intimidating design and a wicked idea for an enemy. Just as you can get the Visage Shield, you can also find the One-Eyed Shield, which is also intended to resemble a dread visage, this time of a malformed one-eyed god. The same one we see in Phase 2 of the Fire Giant boss battle. Really makes me wish we'd have gotten an even more advanced Flame Chariot variant made to resemble the fell god instead of a Fire Giant. Or maybe it's best that Fromsoft did not do that. Maybe it would have made me poo my pant with fear. My pants. We are now going to take a break from Dark Souls, Bloodborne and Elden Ring for a hot minute to talk about something from Demon's Souls. And yes, I'm using footage from the remake here, please don't get mad at me. It's the plague babies found in the Valley of Defilement, specifically in the Maiden Astraea boss arena. The Valley of Defilement in general is for sure one of the most disturbing places Fromsoft have ever created, and that's because of how overwhelmingly disgusting it is. Disgust is a powerful feeling, a repelling natural reaction within us all, here to encourage us to get the hell away from particularly ugly and unclean objects, substances and creatures, so that they cannot pass their disease or general rancid taint onto us, and that taint is very much present in the Valley of Defilement. Every inch of every ramshackle surface is thick and slick with flowing filth, and the grotesque beings who dwell here are similarly filthy with monstrous depraved appearances, living in the most intense pestilential squalor imaginable. I actually thought about choosing the depraved ones for my list, specifically the large ones. These guys are brutal, but no, my pick is for the small beings dwelling within the foul abode of Maiden Astraea, within the bloody fecal swamp by her feet, the plague babies. These cursed infants will emerge as you try and cross towards Astraea, and they'll also rise to get you if you're keen to get the goodies in the area, like the legendary Hero's Soul and especially the super rare Pure Sucker Stone. They are bloated, blistered and bloody, with visible open sores on their skin, no doubt caused by the very plague they can infect you with, a status which I believe is unique to the Valley of Defilement, essentially being a more powerful version of poison, which is essentially a more powerful version of bleed in this game. The Plague Babies truly are the most horrific and misfortunate beings living in the Valley of Defilement, if you can even call this living, and it's the very fact that they are babies that makes them thus, in addition to their horrid designs. Dark Souls 1 had those wee skeleton babies in the Tomb of the Giants, but I never found those to be very disturbing at all, because skeletal designs tend not to be very visually interesting to me. Enemies like this are more on the spooky side, whereas the Plague Babies are horrifying, not least of all because of how bloody dangerous they are to fight. Unless you've got some powerful AoE type ability at your disposal, you are highly likely to perish very soon after leaping into the swamp, not from any plague, but by being literally punched to death and stun-locked by blood babies and losing 83,142 souls because of it. I'm not mad or anything though. Straight back to Dark Souls 3, please, with the sewer centipedes. Good God, these things are gross. Although I find insects to be really cool and interesting, I'm generally not a big fan of actually being near them physically, especially spiders. I'm revulsed by quick, scuttling things with lots of legs. As you'll have discerned from my discussion on the previous entry in the list, dampness and filth also disarm and disturb me, and so when I made it to Irithyll and saw some motionless, multi-legged monstrosity lying face down in the water with its hair spread out over the surface, I said to myself, what the f*** is that? And you can also find them immersed in the profaned capital's toxic swamp. Despite its blue beauty, Irithyll is a very hostile place, filled with fiends of the deep, pontiff knights, unspeakable bestial horrors, and Siegward. But in the wetter sections, the sewer centipedes lie in wait for human victims to savage with their god knows how many legs. And they also have a purple pre-digestive puke attack, because why not? In fact, nearly a third of all monsters on this list have some form of puke attack. Gross. When I first saw the long hair of the sewer centipedes, I was mistaken into thinking they had some feminine quality to them, perhaps one of Pontiff Sullivan's cruel experiments, where he had women transformed into giant bugs. Fromsoft previously did a similar thing in Demon Souls with the Tower of Latria's man centipedes, victims of the old monk. Personally though, I think these are just giant insects with a partial appearance of women, maybe for luring in human prey from afar before they emerge from the water to swallow them whole. Because despite the somewhat human hair, these things don't have a human face at all, it's just a terrible fleshy maw. Fromsoft would later introduce the slightly more anthropomorphic Kindred of Rot in Elden Ring, and then a Scarlet variant in Shadow of the Erdtree, but I find those to just be gross to look at, not to mention annoying to fight. F*** pest threads. The sewer centipedes are just pure nightmare fuel though, tapping into that common revulsion many of us feel towards creepy crawlies. They are based on actual insects which exist in real life too. They particularly remind me of whip scorpions. Ugh. The game Faith also had a similar monster in it, that crazy multi-legged demon that shows up in one of the Chapter 2 endings. I know Faith has nothing to do with FromSoft, but just wanted to bring it up anyway because Faith is awesome. At number 15 I have the putrid corpses from Elden Ring. Somewhat similar manner of entry to Bloodborne's rotted corpses really, with these shambling human shells also being very zombie-like in nature and appearance. They're found in loads of places all over the lands between, but rather than the exact same enemy type simply being copy-pasted everywhere, there are 8 different variants with different appearances and offensive properties, including but not limited to the poison corpses in the Weeping Peninsula, the magic corpses in the Rea Lucaria Cemetery, the blistered corpses in Mogwin Palace, and even the fungal corpses found in Michaelis Halictree and the Weald. The DLC even introduced a new one, with Mesmer Fire putrid corpses being summoned by Fire Knight Wago in the church district of Shadow Keep. The Lands Between is chock full of hideous monsters and formidable knights, with it long having fallen to all-encompassing chaos and horror in the wake of the Shattering. But in addition to the demigods, dragons, and assorted terrors that stalk the land, you can't forget the Walking Dead, the legions of crumbling bone and rotten flesh that are found nearly everywhere, infected and afflicted by myriad elements and ailments. I mean, you have your undead soldiers and undead beastmen, but they're at least still enchanted with some deathly purpose, ready to fight any foolhardy tarnished who walks into the wrong cemetery with weapons and dark magic. The putrid corpses, on the other hand, are completely purposeless, with the extent of their offensive capabilities being to either grab onto you to suck out your life force, puke on you, again with the puke, or most violently of all, to self-destruct in your vicinity. It's not even clear to what extent that latter reaction is intentional by them. It might just be some terrible forced enchantment to render them little more than living landmines. The most upsetting encounter I've had with the putrid corpses though, the one that sealed the deal for me to include them on this list, are the ones staggering along the beach at the west coast of the Weeping Peninsula. It almost seems like they're on some miserable march into the sea, maybe in some fruitless attempt at finally ending their time in this world. It's a sodden, wretched, depressing scene, and it's bloody beautiful too, in a messed up sort of way. Putrid corpses are never a technical enemy to fight, which is why they're always present in great number when encountered, so as to increase their collective threat level, but their presence very much adds to the tragedy and sad horror of the world of Elden Ring. Elden Ring again folks, double whammy, because at number 14 we have the Worm Face. Altus Plateau is the home of the Erdtree, and appropriately, the land, flora and even the very clouds are gold, coloured so by the divine golden rays of the Erdtree, sprouting up from beneath the earth in Leyndell royal capital. However, with the Lands Between having seen far better days, Altus Plateau is no less filled with horror and violence than any place else, and one particularly unsettling section of it is the misty woods beneath the broken bridge, with the mist initially obscuring the forms of the entities within, meaning you hear them weeping before you see them. Don't know about you guys, but me myself personally, as a person, the one thing I don't want to hear when traversing through fog, in real life or in a game, is the sound of weeping. Give me a growl, a roar, or a shriek, but don't give me weeping, otherwise I shall weep, with fear. The source of the weeping is the Worm Face, and these obscure woods are lousy with them. Some congregate in groups, some wear ragged cloaks to conceal their heads, and some are stark bollocking naked. The most notable worm face here in the area is the enormous one by the minor Erdtree. Usually the game has you up against Erdtree avatars or even tree spirits at minor Erdtrees, but for whatever reason, here you've got a big old worm boy to fight. And has there ever been a monster whose name so well describes their appearance? The Wormface has a big wooden stick that it'll spasmodically smash you with, but weapon aside, what makes them so dangerous is the foul worm-filled fluid that they eject from their faces, ad nauseum. Does only minor damage on impact, but it leaves behind lingering clouds of death blight, and of course, if the meter fills up. The immediate area can quickly become nigh on uninhabitable because of these death clouds, because these guys go wild with it, violently shaking their slimy, wormy heads back and forth, spraying it everywhere. Even though this part of the Lands Between is the one that I most associate with worm faces, they are also to be found in number in one section of Faram Azula, where they wear distinctive yellow wrappings around their bodies, and there's a massive one here too. Same with in Mount Gelmir, not too far from the burnt up minor Erdtree. It's possible that this one was previously guarding this minor Erdtree too before it was destroyed by Rykard's blasphemous forces, and it's now just inhabited by an ulcerated tree spirit. I really don't know the lore on these guys at all, because as far as I know they're not referenced in any item descriptions, and their appearances are so anomalous. Sure, there are a few other beings in the game who also use Deathblight, but none who look like this, and their presence in Faram Azula makes them all the more mysterious, because the only other regular enemies in that place are beastmen, stormhawks, and ancient dragons. Whatever the explanations and implications for the Wormface's existence are, they are profoundly disturbing in their appearance and vocalizations, clearly in a state of intense self-disgust at their wormy facial affliction, an affliction you can get an intense and focused view of if you get nabbed by their grab attack. By the way, look at this running animation. Jesus! We've got another one from Elden Ring here, folks, one residing in the most terrifying place in the game, the one that utterly unnerved so many of us after we were cruelly transported there by that blasted bastard of a chest strap in the Dragonburnt ruins. I'm talking Caelid, and I'm talking the monstrous dogs. I like dogs. I love cats. I love cats more than I love my own son, but I certainly like dogs. Fromsoft's games are filled with different types of dog and wolf, and some bloody good ones too, like Great Grey Wolf Sif, the Gravetender Great Wolf, and the Watchdog of the Old Lords. Even just Elden Ring on its own has a load of dog or wolf variants, including one or two rather notorious ones if anyone remembers the Blistered Hound's bugged bite attack before patch 1.04. Believe it or not though, my favourite dog enemy found in Elden Ring is not the Red Wolf of Radagon nor the Dire Wolf, but the monstrous dog found in Caelid, and also the mountaintops of the Giants. For as thoroughly disturbing to the eye as Caelid is, with its rot swamps, fungal hills and colossal skulls poking out from the very earth, a prime factor contributing to the fear and intimidation it put directly into me was the monstrous crows, and especially the monstrous dogs. First saw a crow sitting on a gnarled branch above some ruins, scanning the scarlet horizon for fresh meat to rend with its multitude of saw-like teeth within its brutal black beak, and it freaked me the f*** out. Sure, Bloodborne has its super aggressive carrion crows, but these ones are on another level. To fight, they're pretty much exactly as tough as you'd think they would be, which makes the feeling of dread all the more intense when you're trying to sneak by one only to hear it land on the ground from above and charge right at you. Honestly though, Caelid's crows are more of an honourable mention here, because my main pick goes to the monstrous dogs. Everything about these enemies is wrong. They're too big, they're too muscular looking while still appearing partially starved, given the effect of insatiable voraciousness. Although they have 4 legs, they are withered to the point of now being vestigial, making them look like smaller canine T-Rexes, especially considering the way they stomp around the red soil in search of prey. The most disturbing feature of all with the monstrous dogs though is their eyes. Their cold, small, lifeless, predatory eyes. The eyes and face of a dog should be warm and happy and lovable, not like this. Forget your survival horror games. I don't think I'll ever feel as uncomfortable playing a game as I did upon first reaching the Caelid region, only to see it populated by these hell beasts, feeding on piles of corpses, with that hellish Caelid music playing above it all. To me, the monstrous dogs and crows practically are Caelid. Aha! Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. A game very much focused on themes of immortality. It's even in the name, Shadows Die Twice, referencing the ability of the main character, Wolf, to rise from the dead after sustaining mortal injuries. An ability gifted to him by the Divine Heir, so called because of his sought-after divine dragon blood. Although Wolf loses his left arm at the beginning of the game at the hands of Genichiro, at no other point does he become further disfigured, regardless of how horrific and brutal his injuries are, and my god are some of them brutal. Thus, there's a certain elegance to Wolf's immortality, not least of all because of how pure his purpose is, that being to protect the Divine Heir, unless you go for the Shura ending. However, there are other more unclean and infinitely more unpure forms of immortality, and that brings us to the infested monks. As the Divine Child tells us through the talking tapestry after the elevator to Mount Kongo, the monks of Senpu Temple have abandoned the ways of Buddha, seduced by a search for immortality, and indeed, some of them seem to have achieved it, but my god, it ain't pretty. The first infested monk I encountered was sitting motionless in a small cricket-ridden temple, which is already horrible to me, these oversized insects scuttling around the place. But what's even more horrid is what happens when you approach the monk, who vomits up foul black bile at you. You can even make out tiny centipedes within the fluid, indicating that the infestation has not yet reached full maturity within his body. Further up the mountain though, surrounded by mortal monks kneeling in silent prayer, sits another seemingly dead higher monk. And again, upon your approach, the desiccated husk comes to life, or rather the centipede within it emerges, a parasite protecting its host from damage, and the defensive measures extend far beyond mere insect-tainted stomach acids. These monks are actually really difficult to defeat too, because the movements of the centipede are sudden and violent, and there's the risk of the grab attack, which of course cannot be blocked or deflected. Even if you do manage to kill the monk, after around 10 seconds they just come back to life, because neither the centipedes nor their hosts can be vanquished by normal means, which is where the mortal blade comes in, the only weapon capable of severing immortality. With this blade, the infested monks can be permanently put down, though there's really no reason to actually do this because you don't get anything special for it, and seriously they are awful to fight. I remember when Sekiro was first revealed after Dark Souls 3 came out, and we found out that it was going to be set in Japan. To tell you the truth, I felt a bit disappointed at the time because I loved the outlandish dark fantasy settings in Fromsoft's games, whereas here I was expecting a far more grounded setting due to it being set in a real world country. Thankfully though, when I actually played it, I realised that there was nothing much grounded about Sekiro, and that it wasn't much less outlandish than FromSoft's other stuff at all. And one of the enemies that most stuck with me during the experience, and afterwards, was the infested monks. Particularly with how they're based here in Mount Kongo, which, apart from all the freaks, worms and monkeys which reside here, is a beautiful place. To close out this entry, I would like to recite some lyrics from one of my favourite songs from one of my favourite bands, Defeated Sanity, because the lyrics are disturbing as hell and they really remind me of the monks in this level. Even the album art for Disposal of the Dead is super reminiscent of them, and also I promised one of my viewers that I would squeeze in a Defeated Sanity reference into this video, so here we go. Endless quest for enlightenment, driven to extremes to become one with the exalted, reach immortality. Stemming from Shingon doctrines, bizarre customs emerge, practice of living embalmment baffling uninitiated minds. Persevere to preserve your earthly vessel. Your earthly vessel becomes a monument of spiritual sublimity. Sublimity achieved through acts of self-denial, endurance beyond humanity. Stage 1. Meditation beneath icy waters. Self-imposed hardships to drain body fat. Merciless reduction of food intake, deprived of all earthly pleasures. Stage 2. Bark and roots, your soul nutrition. Toxic substances cause rapid loss of body fluids, vomiting. Arsenic ingestion corrupts the little meat left on your bones. Stage 3. Encased alive in your tomb, engrossed in spirituality. The bell rings for 13 days, until silence signals transformation. Strengthened through excruciation, body fat extermination, deliberate contamination, flesh now unfit for consumption. Torment chalked through meditation, locked tight in lotus position, successful mummification, post-mortal idolization. Sacred site of admiration, a dead body's exhibition, visitors confronted with greatness. At number 11 I have the Deep Accursed, an exceedingly rare fiend from Dark Souls 3. In fact, there are only 2 of them in the game, one in the Cathedral of the Deep and the other in Anor Londo, neither of which respawn after defeat. Whilst making my way through the murky halls of the Cathedral of the Deep past the deviant deacons and giants, There comes a point where you hear the ominous metallic pounding resounding through the halls, and indeed, within this thrall-ridden chapel, an imposing cathedral knight is to be found, clad in steel and armed with a great shield and great mace. So you nail him, perhaps with some difficulty, because these are fairly formidable enemies, and you think, good, hey, not bad. Room cleared. Let's just quickly check in here to pick up that item in the corner, and... did I just hear something? The Deep is a very mysterious concept in Dark Souls 3. I mean, we already had the Abyss established in the previous games in the trilogy. We even technically visit the Abyss in Dark Souls 1. But then the third game introduced this even vaguer other zone with even harder to discern lore. The touch of the Deep is most intensely felt in the Cathedral of the Deep, with its dedicated deacons in sludge swamps, and in Erdtree, where Aldrich, Eater of Men, journeyed to after emerging from his colossal coffin. Erdtree is filled with semi-corporeal humanoid enemies who have been partially eaten by insects of the deep, the same kind of insects you can generate and send forth through the use of the Gnaw miracle, learnable by giving Arena the deep braille divine tome, and even the skilled and graceful Pontiff Knight's weapons have been partially eaten away by such insects. As the description for the Deep Protection miracle says, the Deep was originally a peaceful and sacred place, but became the final rest for many abhorrent things, and one such abhorrent malefactor is the Deep Accursed. Its appearance is an utter abomination, devoid of any light or warmth, dark, deathly and terrifying. I guess its body kind of resembles that of a tarantula, except with 6 legs instead of 8, with these limbs more resembling those of a primate than an arachnid. As well as having a set of spiky mandibles at either side of its face, the Deep Accursed also boasts a wicked set of teeth in its mouth, not to mention a nose beneath its pair of glowing yellow eyes, not going so far as to make it look human, but also not making it look in any way human. Do you understand? Because I have no idea what I just said. The bestial qualities of its enormous form are very unpleasant to look at, particularly considering how relentless and ferocious they are in their attacks and general motions, but it is specifically the curse aspect to them that makes them so deserving of a place in this list. There are a morbid multitude of human skulls and skeletons embedded in the beast's back, and this is a series where the skull symbol is heavily associated with curse. Curse was shockingly punishing back in Dark Souls 1, before becoming little more than a nuisance in Dark Souls 2, but in the third game they brought back its lethality by making it instant death again, though thankfully with no nasty after effects this time. Indeed, just as you might expect from an enemy known as the Deep Accursed, they throw out swathes of grey curse gas, making them extremely dangerous to take on if you're cornered or in an enclosed area, and even worse, its physical attacks cause curse build-up too. Honestly, I've been known to just skip this room in the Cathedral of the Deep entirely on some playthroughs, and to just run through an Orlando straight to the boss Foggate, and that's because this is an enemy that's specifically designed in a way where you'll never even want to get close to it. Couldn't very well leave out Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy now, could we folks? I remember talking to Gideon off-near and looking through his list of demigods still to be defeated, and being particularly intimidated by his description of Praetor Rykard, mentioning volcanoes, appalling battles, and blasphemy. But as well as this, Gideon also notes him as someone who is reviled for his serpentine demeanour. Didn't entirely know how to interpret this line, and the mystery only grows as you make it to Volcano Manor within Mount Gaelmere and converse with the masked Tanith, with her faithful Crucible Knight standing sentinel by her side, and the standing profile of Praetor Rykard visible on the large portrait directly behind her, because although she speaks ever so highly of her lord, he is nowhere to be seen. But regardless of whether you earn an audience with the demigod through a sequence of assassinations or by fighting your way through the manor to Rykard's scorching lair, the monstrosity that greets you is the same, the god-devouring serpent. Becomes pretty obvious early on too that this isn't your everyday god-devouring serpent, what with the pool of magma at its base, its cleft body, and the fact that it has a f***ing pair of arms growing out of it. I'm getting curse-rotted Greatwood flashbacks here. bugger the serpent though, because although it certainly is monstrous, it's not all that hideous to look at. But then we have Phase 2, which is where things get wrong. And here's what's so wrong about it. There shouldn't be a face there. Thoughts? Why is there a face there? I was so freaked out by this cutscene the first time I saw it, and by Rykard's voice. It's as if he's so far gone into his blasphemous transformation that mortal speech no longer comes naturally to him, instead being a strained effort.
Join myself and King as remedy. Together we will devour the very gods.
I don't scare easily when playing games, but hearing Rykard speak gives me the heebie-jeebies. The cleft along the length of the serpent was visible in Phase 1, but it is far more viscerally highlighted in Phase 2 due to the slender red hands which emerge from the moist gore of its inner body. Hands which symbolise the multitudes of Tarnished who Rykard has devoured in his serpent form, all now a part of his family. The fight with the serpent is perilous, but fairly straightforward as long as you're making use of the Serpent Hunter Great Spear, but the battle with Rykard is much more intense. There's way more screaming skulls and cross-arena slashes, and even the false sky within this abyssal lair takes the form of flaming clouds, all of which gather and swirl in anticipation of his ultimate attack, Taker's Flame. This move is terrifying. It makes me physically flinch when it lands. It is of course also usable by the player on a much smaller scale with the blasphemous blade weapon, even draining some of the enemy's life back to you, though it has no such health draining effect on you when Rykard himself uses it, which is a shame because that would have been both cool and on theme. I always knew Rykard was going to be on this list when I began writing it up, but I also knew he wouldn't be in the top 5. I mean, the fight with him is utterly all out in every respect. It's extremely extreme, which is awesome. It makes it really fun, but that also partially detracts from how disturbing he is, because there's really no subtlety here. I mean, let's be honest, Rykard is kind of cartoonish. Even so, he continues to unnerve even after defeated with his dying line, and the sight of Tanith attempting to devour the prodigious flesh of his head afterwards is nightmarish. And here it is, probably the single most disgusting boss that Fromsoft have ever came up with, the One Reborn. I actually had the One Reborn a good bit higher on the list originally due to how utterly revolting it is to behold, but I thought about it some more and decided that although it pretty much scores a perfect 10 on the gore scale, there are other monsters who I consider to be more disturbing on other scales. Even so, I've still placed it within the top 10 and for damn good reason. I am a stone cold sucker for a good boss intro cutscene, one that freaks me out and fills me with hype and anticipation for the coming battle. And yes, I certainly consider the cutscene before the One Reborn to be a certified banger. It'd be kind of beautiful if it weren't so disgusting, the way the red moon looms unnaturally large in the sky before the arcane portal is generated by the Chime Maidens. Initially looking like a strange conduit to the cosmos before you realise that what looked like some red tinted nebula of the abyss is actually an emerging profusion of flesh, dripping rancid juices as it slumps to the ground. Yahar Ghul is an insane level, because it's where the line between nightmare and reality truly starts to blur after Rom is defeated, heralding the blood moon amidst the rolling purple skies. You've got villagers materialising from blood, skull-crammed animated skeletal caskets, and scourge beasts constructed entirely from human limbs. But the One Reborn is the rotten cherry on the mouldy cake, this synthetic old one composed of flesh, bone and blood. You can even make out ambiguous fluids being pumped around its monstrous form via discoloured ducts, and it all makes for such a horrid design. Horrid in a good way, that is. I love this shit. How wrong it looks with all these arms and legs fused into bizarre places, and there are many parts of its body where it's nearly impossible to discern exactly what you're looking at all. As far as the actual battle with it goes, well, it's hardly the most original of comparisons to make at this point. The structure of it very much harkens back to the Tower Knight from Demon's Souls, where there are a number of ranged attackers stationed above, making it very tough to focus solely on the boss from the outset. The difference here though is that taking out all the Chime Maidens forces the boss straight into phase 2, or at least it will always do that loud screaming AoE attack when the last one is killed, which I think means it's gone to phase 2 now. The One Reborn is one of those bosses where you can either have a stupidly easy time taking it out, or an insanely hard and frustrating time, depending on your build and level. If you're able to readily stagger it, especially with a Beast Blood pellet and some bolt paper, you're laughing, because you can chain staggers on this thing and decimate its health bar really quickly. But if your weapon isn't well suited for staggering, the One Reborn is miserable. It's really difficult to get within attacking distance to it without taking some damage yourself. It does crazy damage even with regular attacks, and it can hit you from pretty much anywhere by showering you with piles of blood and gore. Honestly, for as insanely sick as its design is, I don't actually think this is a very well designed boss, and I still have nightmares from taking it on at level 4. Boss quality aside though, the One Reborn's design is outrageously, excessively foul, and makes for an incredible conclusion to Yahar Ghul before you delve deep into the nightmare of Mensis, into the collective consciousness of the cage-wearing cultists who concocted all this chaos. Now for our first shadow of the Erdtree monster, and it won't be the last one either. It's the Furnace Golem. Entering into the realm of Shadow for the first time was a beautiful experience. My excitement levels were pretty bloody high because we finally had some more Elden Ring to play, and when I stepped out from the cave to see the Shadow Tree and the broken land masses and ruins and the heavenly skybox and all the rest of it, I was enchanted. In the midst of it all though, in the distance across Graveside Plain stood a blazing behemoth, the first of the DLC's 8 Furnace Golems. The Furnace Golems are walking automatons, colossal constructs enchanted by Mesmer fire, given motion and a mission to scorch and incinerate all enemies of Mesmer's crusade. Of course, earlier on we discussed another machine of sorts, that being the Flame Chariot, but those are directly and visibly controlled by a human, which is not the case for the Furnace Golems, who operate completely on their own in all cases. Mind you, there are places where you can find destroyed or decommissioned golems, namely in Shadow Altus and the lower levels below Shadow Keep. As anyone who is on nodding terms with the fire triangle will be well aware of, it takes more than just heat to keep something burning, and indeed, the fuel used to keep these furnaces alight is the flesh of humans, horses and even dragons, all encased within this walking prison of wood and iron. We saw a somewhat similar design idea from Fromsoft before with the Rotten from Dark Souls 2, though in that case the bodies were still alive within the larger mass, which should make it more disturbing to me, except it just doesn't for some reason. Would have loved to include 1 or 2 monsters from Dark Souls 2 in this list, but there's something about the graphics and textures in that game that turns me off, even on the enemies and bosses who are on the especially morbid side like this one. Back to the golems though, in addition to their ever-burning furnaces of mesmer fire, they feature a sort of mock face with an eerily placid expression, with horns radiating out from it, designed to mock and terrify the horn scent they've been designed to exterminate. Easily missable detail, but even though it seems like it shouldn't be able to, the expression on the face can change. You can even see it looks slightly shocked when it's knocked down, and it's really unsettling. The implications of these golems' existence is horrific enough without them also being able to change facial expressions. As well as the horned visage, they also feature a pair of mock fire giant effigies around the waist, another similarity with the flame chariots, though these faces look far more like actual fire giants than the chariots do. The actual act of fighting the furnace golem seems to be one where opinions are a bit mixed, understandably. Although they can kick burning clumps of debris in your direction and swing their arms at you, their main attack is to stomp on the ground, causing fast moving waves of fire to discharge out from their feet for a good 40 meters, dealing massive damage if you fail to time the jump, either while on foot or while at a top torrent, and getting caught out by a jumping double stomp is practically a death sentence, unless you've got a ton of health and some damn good fire resistance. The grab attack is also extremely dangerous, though I didn't even know it existed until I eventually got caught out by it on my third playthrough. The most visually impressive move in the Furnace Golem's arsenal, however, is the long-range forward fire vortex of doom. That's not the official name, I just like to call it that. It just looks so freaking cool and travels crazy far, and the blazing spectacle of the Furnace Golems is why I still enjoy fighting them despite how laborious they can be to take down. My least favourite variant of Golem are those which require the hurling of hefty fire pots into their furnace, though I do still appreciate the change in formula. The most damaging pots of all are the hefty furnace pots, craftable from red flesh mushrooms, embers of mesmer and a furnace visage, and an extremely cool visual aspect to these pots is that they resemble actual furnace golems, complete with the horned face, distinctive mesmer fire glow, and the grasping metallic hands over the top of the flame. I know I kinda went on a rant about how generally awesome the Furnace Golems are there, but don't let that distract you from how disturbing I think they are too. Mesmer's crusade against the Hornsent is horrific, and his actions and orders have left this land into little more than a shadow of its former self. Mesmer's merciless handiwork can be seen in many places around the realm of Shadow, but the most grim and vivid testaments to his holy war are the Furnace Golems, there to strike mortal fear and immortal fire into the hearts of every Hornsent in sight. I know there's an awful lot of Elden Ring in this list, but that's simply because it has a lot of horrific monster designs in it, whereas the early Souls games in comparison just don't quite compare to their later games. I am very happy to include another Sekiro monster though. In fact, it happens to be one of my all-time favourite Fromsoft bosses, and one I've spoken about a bunch before. It's the Guardian Ape, found in the Sunken Valley passage. Now, to look at the Guardian Ape at first, you'd never think of it as being remotely deserving of a place on this list. You do not deserve this, ape. And that's because while it is massive and brutal, it's not disturbing or anything, more intimidating, particularly when you catch sight of the enormous sword hilt protruding from the back of its neck, there to indicate that some other brave warrior already tried and failed to take the ape down. Also, it can fart and hurl chunks of its own shit at you. Gotta mention that too. But none of that is why the Guardian Ape is here at number 7. No. He's here because of Phase 2. When you're expecting the transition to happen, it's awesome, but that very first time you finally fell the ape and cut its head off and feel that sweet catharsis as the Shinobi execution message appears on screen and breathe a sigh of relief that the battle is over, only for, after about 10 seconds have passed, the ape to get back up again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the first time I saw this was one of the most thrilling moments I've ever experienced in a game, and the battle which follows more than lives up to the transition which precedes it. Whereas before, the ape's attacks were wild, with frenzied slams, overhead blows and furious thrashing, and the aforementioned shitting and farting, in Phase 2 it's completely different. Here the ape's movements are dexterous and undulating, and instead of bare-fisted pounding, it wields the very sword previously lodged deep within its neck, and in a skilled manner too. Of course, the explanation for this transformation is that just as the monks of Senpu Temple are infested with centipedes, or the worm as they call it in their texts, the same is true of the Guardian Ape, meaning it is effectively immortal. You can get a brief look at the centipede if you use the loaded spear shinobi tool on the neck stump after knocking the ape down, as well as upon defeating it for another shinobi execution. Though at this point in the game you won't yet have the mortal blade, meaning although it's defeated, it's not actually dead. Really would have been nice if Fromsoft would have left well enough alone with this boss, but they didn't, and you do indeed fight the headless ape again in Ashened Depths, except it has 2 health bars now and a smaller mate, and I absolutely hate this fight. It has no new attacks, and trying to fight 2 apes at a time is a complete nightmare. Seriously, I think this is one of the worst boss fights FromSoft have ever made. Regardless, I don't let that detract from the horror and quality of the first experience in Sunken Valley. The transition is shocking, and the way the ape moves and attacks is deeply unsettling, particularly with the action frequently being broken up by the piercing, terror-inducing shrieks from the ape's head as it's temporarily forced back onto its bloodied neck. Top tier fight in my opinion, and genuinely horrifying. It's the Winter Lantern. Bloodborne is chock-a-block full of nasty monsters boasting radically different designs from one another depending on their origins. I mean, your beast varieties look very different to the kin, and the tangled serpentine fiends of the Forbidden Woods share very little in common with the Guardians of the Church. But where the designs get the most out there is when we delve into the Nightmare realms, where sanity and reality completely break down. And it's in these very realms, namely the Nightmare Frontier, Nightmare of Mensis, and the Hunter's Nightmare, that we see the deceptively named Winter Lanterns, but not before we hear their haunting song. Without a doubt, one of the most dangerous enemies in Bloodborne. Sure, the Nightmare Executioners and Shark Giants might be overwhelmingly brutal in both appearance and their way of fighting, but at least they don't have the capacity to end you without even touching you. You might encounter the frenzy status long before facing a Winter Lantern if you get hit by one of the crucifix-carrying church guardians outside Cathedral Ward, but the meter will grow at an alarming pace when you're simply near one of these monsters, so mind-shattering is their song and their multi-eyed gaze, and if the meter fills up, 70% of your max HP gone in a mental flash. Got to say, I hated the frenzy mechanic when I first played Bloodborne. Fights where it's at play are uniquely frantic, because you can't not lose at least some HP, and you've got to keep an eye on the meter, and you have to make sure you don't get nabbed by the Lantern's grab attack, and of course you're also desperate as hell to just kill it so the pain stops, and God help you if there's more than one in the vicinity, which there very well may be in some places. Although partially concealed at first, the grab attack exposes the multitude of piranha-like mouths beneath the rotten brain, which gnaw and tear at your poor hunter's head if caught out by the wide-reaching arms. And of course, your frenzy meter only continues to grow during this time, making getting caught out by the grab doubly dangerous. Nice trick though is to launch a critical attack just before the frenzy meter pops, because this will negate all associated damage. For as weird as it looks, the appearance of the Winter Lanterns isn't at all random. The eye-lined brain head looks exactly like the brain of Mensis, which is found and bound in the Nightmare of Mensis, a higher entity which itself afflicts you with frenzy as you travel through the early stages of the nightmare, though curiously, it's rendered completely non-hostile after you free it from its bondage, down into the black abyss where you can even make contact with it. As for the lower half of the Winter Lantern, it's heavily based on the dress worn by the doll, except completely drenched in blood. As for why it looks like the doll, I really don't know. The doll does reside in the hunter's dream, which itself is disconnected from the waking world, and I guess her presence there has influenced the other layers of reality in particularly nightmarish ways. And I imagine the doll's connection to Lady Maria also has some significance here. More than anything though, even more than how panic-inducing they are to fight or how f***ed up they are to look at, it's the Winter Lantern's song that disturbs me the most. The actual melody is an out-of-order version of Mergo's lullaby that plays during the battle with the wet nurse, but it's the way the voice sounds. I don't even know how to describe it, I just find it to be really, really scary in a genius way. I know their visual design is anything but subtle, but the subtlety of the song is sublime. Good utilisation of sound effects and vocals are key for delivering effective horror, and I think it's something that, more often than not, is done poorly with horror games. Whereas with the Winter Lanterns, I feel so unnerved when I hear the song endlessly sung by these mind-blasting monstrosities as they aimlessly wander the nightmare realms. To kick off the top 5, let's change the mood and talk about something nice for a change. A beautiful angel. Yes, it's the Dreg Heap Angels. Something I've spoken about on a few of my other videos is my love for what could be called divine horror. By that I mean horror that takes ideas of God and heaven and angels, things that most people typically associate with light and benevolence and beauty, even from a secular standpoint, but then subverts them and makes them malevolent and monstrous. Some examples are Killer 7 with its Heaven Smile, not to mention the Angel boss from the first level, Neon Genesis with its crazy apocalyptic angels, Alex Kister's Mandela catalogue series, Bayonetta with its angelic monster designs, and especially the superb Blasphemous series. I find such ideas to be uniquely compelling and disturbing, far more so than demonic and satanic themes, which by now have mostly become rather tired and cliché, lacking the bite and controversy that they had decades ago, with the exception of Faith, which again is awesome and terrifying. Dark Souls 3 is a game that happens to feature its share of divine horror, specifically relating to angels. First example you'll see are the Winged Knights, an enemy type only seen in the high wall of Lothric and Lothric Castle, particularly the higher reaches of the castle above the Grand Archives, where you can even find a golden trio of them complete with sets of white wings. The Winged Knights are those who swore themselves to the angels. Indeed, you can even find an outlandish portrait depicting a particularly grand knight wielding a halberd. Whilst in combat, their repertoire mostly consists of sweeping melee attacks, but they also have the power to throw out divine pillars of light, a miracle you might have gotten flashbacks of when fighting Radahn Promised Consort in the Elden Ring DLC. And the Ascended Winged Knights can even hover a respectable height into the air before flying down to unleash a heavenly strike. The thing you might notice about the Winged Knights though is that despite their allegiance to the angels, they are terrifying. Rather than appearing lithe, radiant and graceful, their armour is bloated and their helms are fixed with menacing steel grins, as if designed to intimidate rather than to inspire. You can find the divine powers of light miracle yourself within a steel cage suspended above the Grand Archives, one containing the dead body of Gertrude, the Queen's holy maiden, who was directly visited by an angel, as further evidenced by the presence of white feathers here in the cage. All this talk of angel lore made me dreadfully interested to know more about these higher entities and what their deal was, but other than the vaguely angelic pilgrim butterflies which appear to hover up towards the heavens during the ascent of Lothric Castle, we don't see any actual angels in the base game, nor in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC. With the coming of the Ringed City DLC, however, we finally gained an audience with an angel, and boy was it not quite what I was expecting. After just a bit of descending down the ashy ruins and toppled edifices of the Dreg Heap past the Merkmen and Harald Knights, the first angel appears, heralding its arrival with furious shrieks before launching relentless barrages of holy light in your direction, forcing you to flee to cover and then only emerge once the blinding assault has stopped. Apparently it's actually possible to kill these angels by attacking them directly, though I can neither confirm nor deny that because I've never tried it myself, and nor will I. Getting a clean shot on one without getting nailed yourself does not sound like fun at all, and they just come back anyway, because to properly put one down, you need to dispatch the pupae larva cocoon thing corresponding to that specific angel, and please observe, if you will, the fact that they're growing out the back of deceased stone-humped pilgrims, the same kind as can be seen in dead multitudes at the broken bridge near the undead settlement, and the same kind seen at the very start of the Dreg Heap, featuring one of my all-time favourite NPCs, the stone-humped hag.
Clamoring tin can was the last, but here we go again. What is it you want from this old stone-humped hag? I've nothing for you, not a smithereen. I just like to stand here and take in the view.
I love her dialogue and voice acting, but more pertinently, if you come back here much later, she's dead, but with a new angel who appears within this zone. One unique in that it's non-hostile, and it doesn't have a corresponding pupae larva cocoon thing either. Getting through the Dreg Heap is no easy feat thanks to the angels, because these holy lasers really sting and are highly likely to hit you at least a few times as you try to sprint to the next cover point. And if you try hiding away for too long, they can hover over you and sprinkle you with feathery curse dust, which again is just a beautiful subversion of the divine. The move makes a nice noise and your character is bathed in light and feathers, but all the while your curse meter is building up, and so you get the hell out of there, only for it to start shrieking again and lasering you. Apparently the lasers were significantly worse at launch too, to the extent that in patch 1.32 their damage was nerfed. I personally really enjoyed the way angels were implemented in the Dreg Heap. Sucks at first, but once you find their pupae larva cocoon thing and put them down for good, it's really satisfying, and now you can go back through the earlier sections of the level and collect all the treasure in relative peace. Thoroughly freaky enemy in all regards that takes what you imagine when reading or hearing the word angel and flips it on its head, and instead presenting you with this shrieking winged monster of curses and death. I love it. Ah, Godric the Grafted, you are one sick son of a bitch. I caught my first dreadful sight of Godric way back in June of 2021 in the gameplay reveal trailer, and although I didn't quite understand what I was looking at due to how wild and weird his design was, made me super excited to play the game so that I can find out what Godric's deal was. There's a ton of build up to the encounter with Godric, who is very likely to be most players' first demigod fight. Stormvale Castle, where he resides and hides, is pockmarked by deathblight in many spots. The place is filled with exiled soldiers and banished knights, as opposed to actual Godric soldiers and knights, and in the dining hall a grafted scion prowls, beneath crude collections of hanging limbs. Indeed, Godric's game is in his very name. Godric the Grafted, so called because of his practice of fusing the limbs of tarnished invaders onto his body, far past the point of aesthetic or anatomical coherence. His torso is made of torsos, his legs are made of legs, the schnozberries taste like schnozberries, and his arms are made up of arms, with yet more arms sprouting up from them to allow for disarmingly quick, spider-like movements along the ground. His design is actually pretty damn similar to the Guardian enemy from The Evil Within 2, which I actually consider to be one of the scariest enemies from any game ever. I mean, just listen to this. Like most things in these games, the actual science behind grafting is never outright explained in-game. Though with the release of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, we can surmise that it's probably in some way related to the horrifying process of shaman sainthood, though more on the jar saints later. Godric also isn't the only being who practices it. The aforementioned grafted scions are also obviously heavily grafted, though the ones we fight, although highly skilled in combat, are perhaps not grafted willingly. Indeed, their faces are disturbingly childlike in appearance, though they do wear somewhat similar gold circlets to Godric. Another notable figure is Godfroy the Grafted, an optional boss trapped in an Everjail in Altus Plateau. Pretty weird encounter really, because Godfroy is only directly mentioned in a single other place, that being the item description for Ancient Dragon Knight Kristoff's Ashes, and the fight with Godfroy is essentially identical to Godric's Phase 1, identical appearance too, other than that blue-green phantom tint. I already spoke about awesome boss intros when talking about the One Reborn, and indeed Godric also has a killer intro. I also spoke about jaw-dropping face transitions when discussing the Guardian Ape, but gotta say, I think Godric's face transition is either on par with the Guardian Ape's, if not even slightly sicker. Because we get to see some live grafting, except it's not the limb of a tarnished he attaches to his hulking form, but a dragon head. The way the dead, blistered dragon spontaneously spurts into life despite its empty eye sockets, and the sound it makes as blood sprays from its mouth is absolutely horrifying, as is the way it's attached to Godric's left arm. There's just a load of pink stretched flesh connecting it to the dragon. Godric's cutscenes were so incredibly badass that when I died to him in Phase 2 I was glad, because it meant I got to watch them all over again, and it also helped that the actual fight with Godric is pretty much top tier, and an ideal early game challenge to work up to. One of the most interesting aspects of Godric that is physically hidden from you at first but is revealed at the end is the fact that he is actually extremely small and frail. His abused manservant Gostok can be seen endlessly stomping on his fallen master's tiny head, gleeful that Stormvale's unworthy tyrant has fallen, and important to note that despite Godric being based here, this was not his castle. He just took it over from some mysterious figure known only as the Storm King. From sword monument text and item descriptions, it's also revealed that Godric was a coward, not even close to matching the power of the other demigods. This obviously goes towards his motivations for the grafting and explains why he took it to such horrible extremes. If he couldn't be powerful enough by nature, then he would artificially make it so. Also, although I didn't realise it till years after its release, Godric appears in his original frail form in the Elden Ring announcement trailer, with his head bowed and his small left arm lodged inside a larger one, the same arm which he'd later grafted to the dead head of a dragon. I love Godric. I love the fight, his backstory and his design, and out of any of the demigods, he in his entirety is the most disturbing. And here's one I had in mind the second I started work on this video. It's Osiros, the Consumed King from Dark Souls 3. Lots of us like dragons, and Fromsoft have featured a bloody lot of them in their games. Elden Ring in particular has a ton of different kinds of dragons and weird offshoot races, but just restricting our view to Souls for a second, Dark Souls 1 had quite a lot too, including some really unconventional ones, like the Undead Dragon, the Gaping Dragon, and of course, who could forget Seath the Scaleless, the Pale Drake. Dark Souls 2 was somewhat more sparse in its selection, but there were still a few, though with the exception of Sin, Slumbering Dragon, almost all of them were to be found in the Dragon Eyrie. With Dark Souls 3 though, almost all the dragons are dead. In fact, almost all of everything in Dark Souls 3 is either dead, rotting, or hopelessly mad, because this is a game about the end of the world. There are a few dragons to be found in the high wall of Lothric and the castle above it, which initially appear mighty and majestic, but as is revealed if you manage to rout them, they are merely being animated by curse-ridden pus of man entities, yet another sign of the end times. Speaking of Lothric Castle, right as you reach it there's the option to turn off into a different area entirely, the Consumed King's Garden. Rather than the garden being lush and green with vibrant plant life however, it is instead a toxified gauntlet, populated by roaming pus of man creatures and cathedral knights for some reason, an enemy who doesn't appear anywhere else in the actual castle level. As you reach the other end of the garden and closer to the fog gate, the sound of intense wailing can be heard from beyond, and its source is Osiros, former king of Lothric, now known as the Consumed King. Look, we've had some weird ass dragons in these games, but Osiros is in a category of his own. He is little more than a failed perversion of what a dragon is supposed to be, and that's because he was, of course, born a human. The reason he became known as the Consumed King is because during his reign he became utterly fascinated with dragons, far past the point of reason and past the purely theoretical. In Erdtree Dungeon, you can find enemies known as wretches, which, if anything, look even more unsettling and pathetic than Osiros. Wretches are also examples of failed dragons, appearing sickeningly pale, scaleless, wingless and mad, miserable failed experiments created through attempts at breeding new dragons into the world. Not entirely sure if these things are related to Osiros, especially with them being locked away in Erdtree Dungeon as opposed to being found anywhere in Lothric, but even so, same sort of idea, and their appearance isn't too dissimilar to that of Osiros. The Consumed King has many strange tendrils drooping off parts of his body, including these massive ones sprouting from his back in an unpleasant fungal fashion. He can also stand on 2 feet, grasp a weapon, and even speak in a human tongue, as no Dark Souls dragon should be able to do. Yes, there was the ancient dragon from Dark Souls 2, but it did not speak in a human tongue at all, but in some ancient enigmatic dragon language of the mind. Osiros looks completely horrifying, but it's his face that really gets to me, specifically the fact that he doesn't seem to have any eyes. There are just these small hollow sockets, again emphasising the abhorrent wrongness of the experiments he and the scholars of the Grand Archives inflicted on him. Osiris essentially tried to turn himself into Seath the Scaleless, to the extent that he even uses the same crystal sorcery favoured by the Pale Drake, which once again has the power to curse you. But we haven't yet spoken about Ocelot, dear little Ocelot. Yep, Osiris is without a doubt as mad as a fish, but he is also one of those rare cases of a boss who talks during combat. The catch is that he's not talking to you, but to the so-called Child of Dragons, Ocelot. You can even see Osiris cradling some invisible object in his left hand in phase 1 while he attacks with his staff, and he speaks to Ocelot nearly tenderly, attempting to get it to awaken. Thing is, you can hear this child, and it's not the first time Fromsoft have featured a magic invisible baby either, because there was the aforementioned Mergo from Bloodborne. The difference here though is that after Osiris loses around 35% of his HP, he does this. That is f***ing horrifying. That's mental. Osiris just completely loses it in frenzied frustration at his child not coming into existence and spreading its draconic wings as it was supposed to. From this point on, he ditches his staff and becomes little more than a rampaging beast, breathing cursed breath and charging around the arena like a wild animal, and he does not speak a single other intelligible word after this point. Mind you, important to point out that you do still hear the cries of Ocelot for the rest of the fight, implying that it's still alive somehow. Well, I'm not sure how. Maybe Fromsoft had to do that to get past the censors or something, because again, Jesus, that phase transition is really messed up. Don't misunderstand though, I absolutely love it. These are the kinds of moments you don't really get with other games, other than the likes of like Silent Hill and Fear and Hunger and whatnot. Everything about Osiris, from his design to his backstory to his bloody phase transition, is profoundly disturbing and upsetting, and that's why he's here in the big leagues of my list. Dark Souls 3 wouldn't quite be the last we'd see of him either, because if you ever got the odd flash of deja vu when fighting any of the demi-human queens from Elden Ring, it's because they basically use the same model as Osiris. Demi-human Margot even does the thing of throwing her staff away and going on all fours. Anyway, on to the next freak. For the penultimate entry on my list, I present you with the bloated head patients of Bloodborne's very own research hall. I guess the difference between this entry and all the others mentioned is that this is nearly more of a category than a single enemy, because there are a bunch of different types here, including the clothed patients, the naked patients, the headless patients, the patients that only have a head, the bound patients, the giant patients, the living failures, and there are probably a few other types too. And let's not forget dear sweet Saint Adeline tied up in her chair on the ground floor. We spoke about divine horror a few entries ago with Dark Souls 3's Angels, but in the research hall the name of the game is medical horror. The research in question all pertains to the Healing Church's attempts at creating beings with the power to commune with the Great Ones, an endeavour which we know the choir would later be successful with when creating the Celestial Emissaries, several of whom we see near Ebritus's lair below the Grand Cathedral. That would be much later in Yharnam's timeline though, because the Church's early attempts were nothing short of barbaric. The researchers restrained patients and injected water into their heads, thinking this would enable them to speak with the Great Ones. Water does have great significance to the eldritch truth in Bloodborne's world, with the various lake and sea runes stating, "Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep." Like many fragments of lore in FromSoft's games, really difficult to interpret what the hell that's supposed to mean, but we do have a direct example of a great body of water serving as a gateway, or I suppose bulwark, to where Rom resides, below the Moonside Lake. But all that doesn't mean you can just go around injecting water into people's heads like some sort of jerk, because as we can see, it has the effect of bloating their heads to grotesque proportions, to the point where all facial features are completely lost. replaced with what looks like a constantly shifting dirty sack, though this does not inhibit their ability to speak, because you can communicate with several different patients throughout the level. Of course, they're all completely insane by this point, though a common theme in what they say is talk of the faint but sticky sound of dripping, which they claim to be able to hear within their heads. You can actually get your own hands on a wearable enlarged head, which I remember initially being disappointed in when I couldn't hear the sound of dripping after putting it on, but upon trying it again after turning down the music slider and turning up the sound effects one, turns out you actually can hear it yourself very faintly. The bloated head patients make traversing through the research hall a grave challenge, though a big reason for that is just how many of them there are everywhere. I'm not normally a big fan of taking weaker enemies and multiplying them through a level, but I think it's fine here because even though they're not terribly difficult to dispatch, even a single patient can badly mess you up if you're not very careful, especially when you consider all the different types who attack you in varying ways. Sometimes in dark rooms, and sometimes in the middle of a narrow stairway with no railings. The most terrifying ones have to be the giants, constantly swinging round tripods and screaming, audible long before you even reach them. The most formidable bloated head patients though have to be the living failures, who are especially inhuman in size and appearance, having been transformed to such a drastic extent that they can generate arcane projectiles from thin air, and even summon meteor showers from some collective pocket cosmos. Regardless of their power, these are still failures, and obviously were never able to successfully commune with any great ones. Like I said earlier, we simply can't forget Adeline, a saint of the healing church who was nonetheless subject to the same water injection treatments as the rest of the patients here. Despite her appalling condition, she's disarmingly nice to us throughout all her interactions, though expresses a near constant craving for brain fluid, murky, mushy brain fluid. You can find this substance from the two bodiless enlarged head patients, and the sound Adeline makes when you gift her with it is... well, it sounds like this.
Oh, thank you. You're terribly kind. Oh, it's wonderful.
After giving her 2 portions of brain fluid, Adeline sheds her lower body entirely, becoming an oversized enlarged head, shifting and writhing in unsettling motions. You can gift her a final brain fluid at this point, leading to her profoundly sad ending. The research hall is one of Fromsoft's greatest ever levels for several reasons, one of which is the army of wretched victims populating its examination rooms, clinics and stairways. The designs and attacks are visceral and terrifying, but it's the fact that you can also hear some of them rant, rave, and even plead with you that elevates them into what I consider to be the second most disturbing monster of any Fromsoft game. But here we are at number 1. And at number 1, I have the Jar Saints from Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. As well as bringing back caves and catacombs, Elden Ring's DLC introduced a couple of new types of dungeon, those being the forges, populated by golem smiths and living magma, and the jails, populated by umbral horn-sent prisoners and the Jar Saints. The first jail most folk are likely to encounter is the Belrat jail, and just a short while into it you can hear the ghost of a prisoner expressing mortal terror at the prospect of some punishment he refers to as the Jar. By a hovel just past Bonnie Village, there's another ghost who's on the other side of such an argument, insisting on some unseen person's proper place being within the Jar, though rather than the one on the other side being a horn-sent prisoner within one of the jails, it's a shaman. As far as we know, the shaman were an innocent tribe of people, likely living peacefully within their picturesque village beyond the hinterlands. Rather than the shamans having been rounded up for Jar sainthood as some sort of punishment, however, they were selected for the unique properties of their bodies, with their flesh being said to meld harmoniously with others. We learn this from the item description for the Tooth Whip weapon, though this strange but significant line is preceded by whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth, filthy and seething with disease. The teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. Even for Fromsoft, that is an incredibly graphic description of some horrible punishment, and the pairing of this description with the statement of the mysterious properties of shaman flesh makes it all the more disturbing. Furthermore, back in Bonnie Village, several masked potentates prowl the pot-littered paths, wielding wicked Bonnie knives which look absolutely identical to the butchering knife from the base game for some reason, but never mind. Speaking of the base game, the Jarbairn NPC from Jarburg also uses the term potentate, asking if our player character might be one upon your first meeting, though I imagine what the Jarbairn means by this term is of a different nature to the proclivities of these maniacs. There's also a jail just by Bonnie Village, in addition to the aforementioned Bellarat jail and the Lamenters jail, and these are where you actually come face to face with the Shaman Jar Saints, and they do not make for a pretty sight. Their arms, legs and faces are exposed, and though somewhat inflamed and discoloured, they are intact and largely functional, though they do run and walk with a distinctly upsetting, shambling gait. And no wonder when you consider the vast amalgamation of pink, distended flesh they carry around on their backs. Indeed, these shamans have had the butchered remains of horn-sent prisoners fused onto them, a feat only possible with shamans. This is that so-called harmonious melding. The shamans are able to use this flesh offensively too. Some have collections of screaming faces poking out from their mass, allowing them to deal damage by screaming. Some can spontaneously explode, damaging corpse matter out from their bodies, and most horrifically of all, they can send out and then retract thick pseudo-tentacles composed of fused limbs. Some Jar Saints can even be found blindly shambling around with great jars still over their bodies, which might be comical if they weren't so overwhelmingly upsetting in every regard. Although the pulsating pink masses attached to their backs are unstable by nature, one physical aspect of the Saints that barely changes at all are their facial expressions. Their eyes are always blindfolded and their expressions nearly serene, despite the unsettling animations of the rest of their bodies, almost as if the flesh has overtaken them and rendered them into frenzied automatons. Although the jails are where most of the Realm of Shadow's Jar Saints are found, there's also a clinic of sorts within Shadow Keep, which also houses a number of them, and it is completely appalling. There is heaps of discarded, discoloured flesh and skin and limbs and filth everywhere, on the beds and on the floor, with enormous sensors installed in the room in a no doubt fruitless attempt at masking the overwhelming stench of death and decay. With this place being located within Shadow Keep, which has long been under the control of Mesmer, I was initially surprised and confused to find the Jar Saints here, but rather than this being a place where new saints were created, it was likely intended to be a clinic of sorts, to try and save afflicted shamans from their grisly fate. Judging by the condition of the place, however, and the fact that it has been totally abandoned by humans, clearly salvation was deemed to be an impossibility. The Jar Saints were always going to score highly in this list, though the thing that propels them to the number one spot in my eyes is the comparative beauty of the Shaman Village. It's a strong contender for the most beautiful area Fromsoft have made, particularly with the way the lonely minor Erdtree radiates gold for the benefit of no one, and how there's the blindfolded body of a shaman elder within the trunk of a tree, who the golden braid talisman describes as being Marika's grandmother, or at least she was the grandmother of the village. There's this radiant natural splendour here, this warm and colourful home which should be busy with shamans, and yet it is empty because everyone here was butchered, whipped and forcibly melded, transformed into tortured, trembling terrors, left screaming and twitching beneath the earth. and that is why the jar scents are number 1. And there you have it, folks. There is my list of the 20 most disturbing, messed up, upsetting, unsettling creatures from all of Fromsoft's modern games. Some of you may have noticed that I didn't include Ludwig the Accursed, which you could argue is a pretty outrageous omission. I did seriously consider featuring him, but I find his design to be more monstrous and bestial and frankly awesome than disturbing. He's more a monster that makes me feel incredibly hyped up than disturbed, especially with that Phase 2 cutscene where the Moonlight Greatsword is revealed. Even so, I probably should have included him, I just, didn't. Ludwig aside, I hope you enjoyed the video, and feel free to post down in the comments what you think are the most disturbing FromSoft monsters, because different things freak out different people for different reasons. Maybe some of you are scared shitless by Priscilla or something, I don't know. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, cheers for watching and cheerio.